Between 1840 and 1860, roughly 400,000 people traveled the 2,000-mile path of the Oregon Trail, encountering sickness, death, exhaustion, and other hardships. The road was long and arduous, but for these determined pioneers, life continued on and even settled into a routine. Here's what life was really like on the Oregon Trail. Pioneers who journeyed on the Oregon Trail used wagons. Pioneer wagons had to be light but durable enough to take a beating. Most settlers used converted farm wagons, while others relied on ones specially made for the Oregon Trail. A common misconception is that overlanders used Conestoga wagons. They did not. Those famous wagons were used for freight on other trails. They were much too heavy for crossing the prairies. The wagons that pioneers used were often simple farm wagons fitted with covers made of canvas. They weighed up to 1,400 pounds and hauled nearly a ton and a half. Because of the strain, trail wagons were usually mostly made of hardwoods such as oak, hickory, and maple. The wagon bed, at only 4 feet by 10 feet, was crammed with supplies. If the wagon broke down on the trail, it could be an arduous, if not impossible, process to fix it. The tires, axles, and the connections in the undercarriage took the most abuse. These parts were reinforced by iron. The whole ensemble was covered up with white canvas held by hoops, which led some to call the pioneer wagons prairie schooners. Prairie schooners made for an uncomfortable ride. There were no springs or suspension systems to cushion the jolts of 2,000 miles of rocky wilderness. Most overlanders, therefore, walked, not just because of the lack of comfort, but because the wagon was full of stuff. Because the Oregon Trail was so long and so full of unknown hazards, pioneers organized themselves into larger caravans called wagon trains. This created a mobile community that had the virtue of protection in numbers.
Best not to get too far from the train, miss. It's like the ocean out here.
The pioneers were also well-structured. Wagon trains operated through written agreements that dictated rules of who does what and designated officers to the caravan. Such contracts were used until about 1850, when they were replaced by more informal agreements. All these wagons had a direct impact on the environment. To this day, ruts from Oregon Trail wagon trains are still visible. In fact, the trail was modified over time as pioneers discovered shortcuts. Overlanders even carved graffiti into stone, with one prominent example being Independence Rock in Casper, Wyoming, which was dubbed one of the registers of the desert. Oregon Trail pioneers needed a considerable amount of equipment in order to survive the months-long journey. Not only did they need basic tools to repair broken wagons, but also rifles to hunt game, bedding, tents, and cooking equipment. Pioneers usually only had up to 3 sets of clothes made of wool or linen, and that had to last through the entire journey. There are actually few surviving examples of Oregon Trail dress, since the clothes were so worn out by the time the pioneers reached the trail's end, they were either recycled or discarded. Also discarded were those items that were found to be impractically too heavy for the trail. As the animals hauling the wagons grew increasingly tired, the pioneers were forced to get rid of all things not essential. The trail was strewn with furniture, trunks, beds, cast iron stoves, and other personal belongings. What was most essential for the pioneers was to have a large stockpile of food. When you walk for 2,000 miles, you are going to burn lots of calories. A hiker without a pack walking 4 miles per hour on level ground path burns about 106 calories per mile. In the best of circumstances, it may be assumed that an Oregon Trail pioneer walking 15 miles a day was expending about 1,600 calories a day at minimum. This is a very low estimate, since a pioneer would be dealing with rugged terrain. To fuel their bodies, the settlers needed lots of food. The Oregon Trail pioneers didn't concern themselves with eating healthy. Instead, they focused on eating food that could last for months. It's estimated that a family of 4 required 400 pounds of bacon, 600 pounds of flour, 100 pounds of sugar, and 200 pounds of lard. They also often brought dried peaches and apples, as well as sacks of rice. To wash it all down, they carried 60 pounds of coffee and 4 pounds of tea. In addition, they also frequently carried cornmeal, butter, vinegar, salt, and baking soda from the larder. And of course, there was whiskey or brandy for medicinal purposes. On the journey, overlanders would supplement their meals through hunting and fishing. A larger family often required more food, which could exceed the recommended carrying load of the wagon. Some families had to bring 2 wagons with them, while others brought their own livestock, like cows, for dairy products. One of the most important choices an Oregon Trail pioneer had to make was what animals to bring, and potentially the most critical was selecting which draft animals to haul the wagon. This choice boiled down to either mules or oxen. Oxen were sometimes preferred since they were able to live off of the wild pasturage. Some overlanders believed that these animals would not wander off, and Native Americans were uninterested in them, so there was no threat of theft. The same was true for mules. However, while mules had the virtue of speed, they were harder to handle than oxen. Oxen were also cheaper than mules. Overlanders often waited until they reached a departure point to purchase their supplies and draft animals so that they were in the freshest condition. It was also cheaper to buy the animals in, say, Independence rather than back east. Many of these animals never finished the journey. After a few weeks of hauling heavily laden wagons, the animals would flag, and many would either refuse to go any further or simply collapse and die. The pioneers would see dead animals on the trail every day. Sometimes the bodies could be eaten, or sometimes the meat was sold. When animals did perish, the immigrants often were forced to buy replacements for stiff prices at the far-flung trading posts and forts along the trail. One of the great myths of the Oregon Trail that is finally being thoroughly debunked is that Native American tribes were a menace to the pioneers. The truth is that the relationship between the immigrants and Native Americans were more complex. The pioneers were passing through the lands of a number of tribes with complex societies, including the Sioux, Cheyenne, Comanche, and Arapaho. The pioneers were generally filled with paranoia about Native American attacks, and it's that paranoia that is carried down in popular memory.
Mr. Harris, were those real wild Indians?
Oh, no, Richard. They were friendly Indians.
Darn.
The Native Americans generally viewed the travelers as potential trading partners. They would supply the settlers with food in exchange for tools, firearms, and small trade goods like mirrors and metal tools. Overlanders hired Native Americans to herd their livestock, assist in crossing rivers, and help guide them along the trail. Rinker Buck, author of The Oregon Trail, A New American Journey, in an interview with National Geographic, stated, "They bartered with immigrants for trinkets, supplies, and horses. They were very helpful at first. In fact, the ingenuity of the Indians in crossing the rivers was a crucial aspect of the Oregon Trail. You had to ford numerous rivers, and the Shoshones, Pawnees, and Sioux were extremely adept at helping the pioneers make these fords." As time went by, the relations between the pioneers and Native Americans grew worse. The immigrants never got over their paranoia and frequently shot at peaceful Native Americans. Rinker Buck noted to National Geographic, "For about 20 years, it was very friendly as opposed to the impression that you get from Hollywood movies. But when the Indians realized the white man was there to slaughter the buffalo, their protein source, and we did, in hellacious numbers, they turned hostile and declared war." Most of the attacks on the Oregon Trail occurred near the Snake and Humboldt rivers or near the southern end of the Willamette Valley to the Applegate Trail. Still, casualties were lower than you may have thought. John Unruh calculates in his book, The Plains Across, that between 1840 and 1860, 362 pioneers were killed by Native American attack, and 426 Native Americans were killed by pioneers, with most of the deaths occurring in the latter years. Keep in mind that Native Americans were far more impacted by the diseases brought by settlers and their impact on the environment. Even though the threat of violence from Native Americans was exceedingly minimal, the Oregon Trail was still highly dangerous. The mortality rate of the pioneers may have been up to 10%. The causes of death were numerous. Pioneers brought firearms with them for hunting and sport, and accidents through inept handling frequently occurred. Other major accidents included drownings and being run over by wagon wheels or by the animals they brought. Harsh weather also played a factor, which included lightning strikes. Yet the biggest killer was disease. Pioneers suffered from measles, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and dysentery. These diseases were dwarfed, however, by cholera, which was the chief killer on the Oregon Trail. Cholera, which is caused by bacteria in tainted water, causes abdominal pain, diarrhea, vomiting, and death. A person may die within 12 hours of the onset of symptoms.
Yesterday morning, he was fine.
It is very quick, Carlo.
The The worst outbreaks of cholera occurred between 1849 and 1852. Overlander Cecilia Adams wrote in her 1852 diary, "Past 7 new-made graves. One had 4 bodies in it. Cholera. A man died with the cholera ahead of us." Estimates vary, but disease alone may have claimed up to 30,000 pioneers. Children shared the dangers of the Oregon Trail with their parents. Some estimates say that as many as 40,000 of the pioneers were children. Children on the trail took part in the same chores and duties as adults. One family with 9 children only permitted the 3- and 5-year-olds to escape work. Such chores may be to help bake food, assist driving the wagon, or minding any of the loose livestock the settlers brought. There was no formal schooling on the trail except for what the family could tutor them. Children brought with them vivaciousness, which enlivened the camp. At night, they played games like leapfrog and London Bridge, as well as song and dance. One such account states that a boy named Robert got his hands on a pair of Spanish spurs. He put these on and then attempted to ride one of the tempestuous mules. One of the party reported, quote, "He looked so ridiculous flying over the mule's head. We heard no more of Spanish spurs." As that story illustrates, children often were seriously injured, with some dying in accidents on the Oregon Trail. Such cases included a wagon wheel rolling over a child, breaking limbs, or outright killing them. An 1849 diary entry records, "A lady and 4 children were drowned through the carelessness of those in charge of the ferry." As the emigrants crossed North America, each wagon train fell into a routine. A typical day began at 4 a.m. to the sound of a bugle or rifle to wake up the caravan. At 5 a.m., the livestock that was let loose to graze overnight were rounded up, after which breakfast was served. By 7 a.m., the evening camp was packed and wagons hitched. At a sound of a trumpet and a call, "Wagons ho!" the caravan proceeded with men riding ahead on horses to scout the path. At noon, the wagon train halted for a rest and a meal. At 1, the caravan was on the way again, generally proceeding until about 5 p.m., when camp was made by circling the wagons as a corral, followed by suppers, daily tasks, and some leisure time. Typically, the camp turned in at 8 p.m., and a guard was set who was relieved at midnight. The process would then repeat itself at 4 a.m., with the exception of some wagon trains that halted for extended periods or for the entire day on Sundays for religious observances. With a journey so long and monotonous, Oregon Trail pioneers adopted routines and even a semblance of what settled life was like. There were a number of marriages and births on the trail. Most weddings occurred at the demarcation points in the east. Romance also bloomed on the road, though, and couples married. The newlywed couples were often subjected to a joking custom supposed to prevent the consummation of the marriage, which might entail banging pots and pans and dragging the newlyweds out into a drunken mock parade. With a journey so long, though, tempers sometimes frayed. According to Rinker Buck, as pioneers moved further, fights would break out, especially during river crossings in which people's livestock and possessions would get mixed up. Buck said, "People would pull their guns out and start shooting each other. I feel that the Oregon Trail years and the stresses and the tensions of the crossing introduced this kind of violence into the American ethos." Perhaps the pioneer Lauren Hastings summed up the Oregon Trail experience best when she later told the Oregon Pioneer Association, "I look back upon the long, dangerous, and precarious emigrant road with a degree of romance and pleasure. But to others, it is the graveyard of their friends." It wasn't all fun and games on the Oregon Trail. Some really messed up things happened on those journeys, and it's a lot worse than just dying of dysentery. In truth, there wasn't much conflict between the Native American tribes and early pioneers, who were mostly fur traders and missionaries. But that's not to say there wasn't the occasional violent encounter, especially once settlers started heading west and claiming land for themselves. One such violent encounter involved the ill-fated Utter-Van Ornum wagon train, which would go down as the deadliest wagon train in the trail's history. Led by Elijah Utter, the group included 4 families, 21 children, and a few former soldiers. They were attacked near the modern-day border of Oregon and Idaho on September 9, 1860, and 11 died in the 2-day confrontation. According to the story, the soldiers with the group took the first opportunity to take the best horses and escape, leaving the party with a broken defense. The group scattered, and one of the soldiers made it to a military camp outside Fort Dowells to sound the alarm. Over the weeks that followed, the rescue parties encountered several starving survivors, but the worst was a camp of people who had been so desperate for food that they had resorted to eating their dead. Colonel George Wright, who oversaw the rescue mission, later said the whole wagon train likely would have been able to defend themselves during the initial attack if it wasn't for the cowards who fled. The National Park Service has described the Oregon Trail as, quote, this nation's longest graveyard. It is estimated that 1 in 10 travelers didn't survive their trips, and the National Oregon-California Trail Center says the 2,000-mile passage averaged around 10 deaths per mile. There was just as much dysentery and cholera as your MS-DOS family faced, but there was also another problem: a lack of gun safety classes. That's not a joke. Blue Mound, Kansas was the site of what's purported to be the first accidental gun death on the Oregon Trail, and it happened to the ironically named John Shotwell. According to historical records, Shotwell's deadly injury occurred as he was pulling a gun from the back of his wagon, muzzle first. When the weapon unexpectedly discharged, he was fatally shot in the chest. But he didn't die immediately. It reportedly took Shotwell over an hour to pass away, in full possession of his senses. Shotwell was far from the only person to die from an accidental gunshot on the trail. Behind diseases, they were the second leading cause of death for Oregon Trail pioneers. So it was considerably more likely that travelers would be killed by their own weapons than by Native Americans. Not only is that fact surprising, it's also a little embarrassing. The Oregon Trail may have been dangerous, but when it comes to the death toll, travelers were often their own worst enemies.
And even if you survive all those things, you know what else can kill you? The fucking doctor.
Settlers traveling the Oregon Trail carried standard medicines like castor oil, peppermint essence, rum, opium, and whiskey, all of which were useful to at least take your mind off the fact that you were dying. Granny medicine, essentially home remedies passed down from mother to daughter, was common, and some things, like using peppermint essence to calm an upset stomach, actually worked. But the problem was that it was typically only the women who knew these remedies. When they died or got sick, the men were left to make up things and see what worked.
Get out, you quack!
Plenty of people had the misfortune of encountering quack doctors on the trail too. Edwin Bryant, a writer who recorded many observations from his times on overland trails, told the tale of a boy who had his leg crushed by a wagon wheel. The injury was treated by a man who tied some linen and a few planks around it. 9 days later, the boy, quote, called to his mother that he could feel worms crawling in his leg. In other words, he felt maggots eating him. Bryant helped hack off the leg with a butcher knife and a handsaw, but the boy ultimately died of his injuries. As Bryant put it, quote, the child was dead. His miseries were over. That's one way to spin it. Nice work, team. When Brigham Young and his Mormon followers found what would later become Utah, they thought they had found paradise on earth. All they needed to do was populate the place with Mormon converts. The plan was simple. British and Scandinavian converts who were too poor to buy wagons would be invited to load all their worldly possessions onto a handcart, push them across the U.S., and try to make the cross-country journey in only 60 days. Sounds great, right? Think again. As writer David Roberts wrote in his book Devil's Gate, the Mormon handcart expeditions were, quote, the most deadly chapter in the history of westward migration in the United States. The ambitious-sounding operation was poorly planned, which would almost be funny if so many people didn't suffer as a result of the neglect. There were no supply stations, carts broke down better than they rolled, Salt Lake City officials had no idea who was coming, and travelers weren't prepared for doing the work of hunters, pioneers, and oxen all at the same time. Between 1856 and 1860, 10 handcart companies traveled the trail, and 2, the Martin and Willie companies, suffered heartbreaking tragedies. There were 1,100 people in those 2 companies alone, and they didn't set out until August. When winter arrived, they were buried under feet of snow. Hundreds died, and those who survived lost arms and legs to frostbite. Despite the unnecessary tragedy of the Mormon handcart episode, there's a fascinating footnote that comes out of all of it. 2 survivors were 10-year-old Ann Campbell Giles and 12-year-old Maximilian Parker. They lived, met, married, and had a son you probably know of, Butch Cassidy. No wonder he was so tough. Just look what his parents went through.
Back in the glory days of MS-DOS, the Oregon Trail was a dangerous place to bring your family of pixels. And back in the late 1800s, the real Oregon Trail wasn't a whole lot safer. It took between 5 and 6 months for settlers to cross the country on this rugged thoroughfare, which left a whole lot of opportunity for messed up stuff to happen along the way. Here are the most unsettling bits from the annals of Oregon Trail history. The Sager Orphans. In early 1844, 6 children set off from Missouri with their parents Henry and Naomi Sager, who was pregnant and gave birth to a 7th child in the wagon on the way. That's when things started to go wrong. By the time they reached the Rockies, the children's father contracted an illness that proved fatal, and their mother passed away soon after, seemingly from grief. The kids wound up in the care of missionaries Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, who established a safe home in the Walla Walla Valley and adopted all 7 Sager siblings. Unfortunately, 3 years later, a massacre took the lives of both the Whitmans and the 2 elder Sager children, John and Francisco. The others were taken captive, but only 4 survived the ordeal. 2 of the girls ultimately authored memoirs as adults, choosing to focus on the kindness they experienced from fellow travelers on the Oregon Trail rather than the tragedy. The Donner Party. You're probably familiar with the story of the Donner Party, the most famous or infamous travelers on the Oregon Trail. Only 48 of the party's original 87 members made it to the end of their journey, thanks to the fateful decision to use a dangerous shortcut called the Hastings Cutoff. It wasn't their fault, though. A scout riding ahead of the party noted that the route was too dangerous to travel and sent a warning back to the party at Fort Bridger, alerting them that they shouldn't risk it. Unfortunately, the letter ended up in the hands of Fort Bridger's greedy owner, Jim Bridger. Since steering people away from the cutoff would have cost him money, Bridger withheld the message, sealing the Donner Party's grisly fate. Taking the Hastings Cutoff caused a series of mishaps and delays, culminating in an early snowfall that left the party trapped in the Sierra Nevada for months on end. When their dwindling supplies ran out, the Donner Party turned to cannibalism, eating the flesh of their deceased fellow travelers. But for one man, surviving that winter came at a lifelong price. Louis Kesselberg was among the survivors who made it out of the Sierra Nevada and settled in California. But once he was there, rumors started circulating that he'd been a little too enthusiastic about eating his friends, and that human was still his favorite type of meat. It got so bad that Kesselberg ultimately sued for slander and won, but he never escaped his grisly reputation. Before he passed away in 1895, he wrote, "A man, before he judges me, should be placed in a similar situation." The milk sickness. Back in the heyday of the Oregon Trail, the parties of migrating Americans included a fair few pregnant women or new mothers and their newborn babies, who often became orphans en route thanks to the trail's dismal survival rate. When that happened, the baby would typically be passed into the care of another nursing mother. But since medical knowledge was in short supply, these arrangements didn't always end well. In at least one case, the nursing mother feared that the baby might be carrying a contagious disease and opted to give her cow's milk instead of breastfeeding. Unfortunately, the cattle were grazing on plants like poison ivy and white snake root, creating lethal and bitter milk that poisoned the infant. We'll never know how many babies succumbed after drinking contaminated cow's milk, but since livestock on the trail were forced to forage on seriously overgrazed land, an enormous number of them would have been carrying deadly juice in those udders. John Grattan starts a war. Early contact between settlers and Native Americans was relatively peaceful, but as more people headed west, tensions began to simmer. And on August 19, 1854, one hot-headed idiot kicked off a war that would last 22 years. At that time, the influx of settlers on the land was straining the resources and the patience of the local Sioux, who started demanding tolls from travelers passing through on the Oregon Trail. The conflict culminated in the slaughter of a sick cow from a wagon train which had wandered into a Sioux camp full of starving people. But that wasn't the problem. The officer in charge planned to keep it peaceful and give restitution to all involved. Unfortunately, he chose the wrong man to negotiate. John Lawrence Grattan, a second lieutenant stationed at Fort Laramie, showed up to the meeting with a bad attitude and a bunch of howitzers. And what happened next will not surprise you. Grattan didn't survive the skirmish, but the fallout from his dumb decision would continue on for more than 2 decades.
2,000 miles to go. What kind of wagon would you choose? Fast and light, heavy and strong? One thing's for sure, you wouldn't be riding in it. Here's why. Traveling along the Oregon Trail was actually more complicated than it sounds. From the different types of wagons used to the animals needed to pull them, a lot of different factors went into traveling west. Plus, the real reason that people rarely rode in wagons on the Oregon Trail makes a lot of sense. Almost from the moment Europeans first landed in North America, they wanted to keep moving and exploring the vast lands before them. The concept of westward expansion really took off once Thomas Jefferson negotiated the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which essentially doubled the size of the country overnight. In a few short years, the Lewis and Clark expedition reached the Pacific Ocean. Journeys like this and others like it resulted in what we know today as the Oregon Trail.
But if we don't find someone who can lead us to Oregon, they're all gonna die.
In the early 19th century, people only had so many ways to travel, especially to go long distances. Mostly people walked, but sometimes you had a horse or a mule. Other times you might be able to get your hands on a wagon. With the explosion in the number of families looking to move west, wagons quickly became the top choice for their cross-country journeys. The most popular type of wagon was known as a prairie schooner, and it needed to be strong and sturdy, as well as light enough to not tax whatever animal was pulling it. It is a common misconception that all wagons the pioneers used were the same. In reality, travelers had a choice between two different types of wagons. A wagon known as a prairie schooner got its name from the white cover over the back, that when viewed from a distance resembled the sails of a type of boat called a schooner. This type of wagon was lighter and smaller than its counterpart, which made it more suited to long-distance travel. As the Oregon Trail is 2,000 miles long, which would take months to travel, a smaller vehicle was theoretically more practical for the journey. The other type of wagon available was known as a Conestoga wagon. This type of wagon was definitely more formidable and heavy-duty than the prairie schooner. Its original design and purpose was for hauling various types of freight over land. Though the Conestoga has similar features to the prairie schooner, such as the canvas top or bonnet, there were a couple of important differences as well. The Conestoga's size and structure of the box was different from the schooner, as it was larger and the shape was not completely flat in order to keep cargo from bumping around. Due to the increased carrying capacity, its structure was heavier and it could handle a lot more weight. This bad boy reportedly carried up to 6 tons and often required a full team of horses to pull it. And as it turns out, these animals weren't just any horses, but special ones known as Conestoga horses. Conestoga horses were bred for this kind of work and apparently had the ability to travel up to 14 miles at a time, which made them ideal for towing heavy loads. Despite the potential advantages of such a sturdy rig and the perfect animals to move it, the dimensions, design, and additional weight made this particular style of wagon less than ideal for cross-country travel.
I'm feeling wagon sick. Can you rub my belly?
Photographs and paintings of these wagons often show a fully packed wagon. This would make sense because the travelers using these wagons are literally picking up their entire lives and lugging all of their possessions thousands of miles to a new home. However, photos and paintings don't show them stuffed to the brim. Though the wagons carried everything these travelers owned, prairie schooners also couldn't be too heavy, as it could hurt the animal that was towing it or might even cause damage to the wagon itself. Imagery of wagons on the Oregon Trail often shows women and children riding along on their way toward their destination. However, it turns out that people actually didn't ride in wagons very often at all. One obvious reason for this is that the wagons were already packed full of belongings. The other is that prairie schooners are reportedly extremely uncomfortable due to the lack of springs or suspension systems to help smooth out the ride. Therefore, it would have been more common for travelers to walk alongside the wagons instead of traveling inside them. Was it hubris? Was it naivete? Was it a plan so wild it just might work? Up until the moment everyone realized it hadn't, there were many factors that led to the tragic end suffered by the Donner Party, and they may have been doomed from the start. While the western part of North America had seen permanent European settlements dating back to the earliest days of the fur trade, the early 19th century was the start of the United States' large push to fully settle the western part of the continent. Starting with Thomas Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase and continuing through the century, the American frontier began pushing farther and farther west. By the 1840s, there were a lot of people looking to migrate west, and almost as many reasons for wanting to make the trip. Some of the settlers were in search of land, which was becoming more scarce in the eastern part of the country, while others later sought the get-rich-quick scenario that came with finding gold. Still others, namely a large number of Mormons that made their way west, were searching for a place to freely practice their religion. With so many motives for journeying west, there were also several ways to get there. According to National Geographic, several popular trails served as guides to settlers. Perhaps the most famous of all is the Oregon Trail, which started around the border of Missouri and Kansas before trudging across the Great Plains and snaking through the Rocky Mountains. There was also the Mormon Trail, which started in western Illinois and followed a similar path to the Oregon Trail. This one, however, ended up near what became Salt Lake City, Utah. They were tried and true routes, but even 19th century Americans weren't content to settle. The California Trail Center says that Lansford Hastings was one of the people who made his way west, doing so in 1842 along the Oregon Trail. his story was a little different than most. While many settlers had taken to the western trails to escape difficult lives, having been born the son of a doctor, Hastings had a comparatively comfortable life. After attending law school, Hastings made the trek to Oregon, but by 1843 he had made his way south to California. At the time, California was mostly Mexican territory, and Hastings recognized that there were immense opportunities there. In order to encourage settlers to carve a piece of land out for America, he published a book called The Immigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. In the book, he laid out a shortcut to California that he claimed would shave off nearly 400 miles over easy terrain. Was it too good to be true? Yes.
Could we have looked into the future and seen the misery before us, these lines would never have been written. But we were full of hope.
Legends of America says that Hastings never tested the route. Little did he know that his shortcut would inspire one of the American West's greatest tragedies. The idea for the group that would become infamously known as the Donner Party was started by an Illinois businessman named James Fraser Reed. Reed, like so many before him, wanted to travel west in search of riches, but he was also incentivized by the prospect of a better life for his wife, Margaret. She experienced severe headaches, and Reed thought that perhaps the West Coast climate would help her health. Reed read through a copy of Hastings' The Immigrant's Guide to Oregon and California and was inspired to put together a group for a westward journey. The initial group consisted of 9 wagons and 32 people. 9 of those people were members of the Reed Party, which includes James, Margaret, their 4 children, Margaret's mother, and a pair of hired servants. While the trip was no doubt going to be arduous, James Reed paid to make sure that his family traveled comfortably. They did so in a 2-story wagon that took 8 oxen to pull and featured a stove, cushioned seats, and even bunks. It was so extravagant that Virginia Reed, who was 12 years old at the start of the trek, called it the Pioneer Palace Car. Over time, the group would expand as several other families joined what became known as the Donner Party. According to Legends of America, the group set out from Springfield, Illinois on April 16, 1846, and their first waypoint was the town of Independence, Missouri, the starting point for both the Oregon and California trails. Among the group were 2 brothers in their 60s, Jacob and George Donner, and their families. This trip wasn't the first for the Donners. They were of German descent and had started traveling before this event began, starting in North Carolina and moving progressively farther west each time, with stops in Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois. It's believed that the Donners were also intrigued by Hastings' proposed shortcut to the West Coast, as Jacob Donner kept a copy of his book in his saddlebag. What those in the Donner Party didn't realize was that a strange coincidence with some serious irony to it was taking place across the country. On the same day as they left Springfield, Lansford Hastings was departing California to see his proposed shortcut for himself. Reed and the Donner Party reached Independence, Missouri 3 weeks later. There, they resupplied and started again, eventually joining another wagon train about 100 miles west of Independence. This expanded the group to 87 people. Weeks later, the group would reach Fort Laramie, Wyoming. There, James Reed met a friend from Illinois who had traveled with Hastings eastward. This friend advised Reed not to take Hastings' shortcut, telling him that they would never make it using wagons as the route was barely traversable on foot. He also warned Reed of the dangers posed by the desert and the Sierra Nevada mountains. More wagons joined the group in Fort Laramie, and upon reaching the Continental Divide of the Rocky Mountains, a man with a letter from Hastings met them. The letter said that Hastings himself would meet them in Fort Bridger, Wyoming, to show them where to take his shortcut, which was becoming known as Hastings Cutoff. They had no way of knowing it at the time, but the decision that would cost many in the Donner Party their lives happened near Wyoming's Little Sandy River. To that point, the group had followed the established trail, but Little Sandy River marked the point where the trail split with Hastings Cutoff. A schism occurred in the group, with some of the pioneers heeding the warning James Reed had received in Fort Laramie and opting to continue on the California Trail. Meanwhile, the other group, who were willing to risk it on the unproven alternative route, selected a new leader, George Donner. The Donner Party followed the Hastings Cutoff to Fort Bridger, but instead of meeting Lansford Hastings himself, they found only a letter that had been left with a group of other travelers. History says that this note said that Hastings had joined another group and had gone ahead, encouraging the Donner Party to catch up, and saying that he would mark the trail for them. Feeling confident about Hastings' proposition, the group, consisting at this point of 89 people and 20 wagons, left Fort Bridger. If any member of the Donner Party was still hopeful that the rest of their journey to California along Hastings Cutoff would be smooth sailing, they would have been having second thoughts by the time the group reached Weber Canyon. According to history, Hastings had promised them that Weber Canyon would provide them with a safe way of traversing the Wasatch Mountains, a rugged part of the Rocky Mountains located in modern-day Utah. But upon reaching the canyon, the members of the Donner Party found yet another note from Hastings. This note warned them that this part of the route was more dangerous than he had initially believed. He advised them to wait there until he could return and show them a better way through the mountains. This put the Donner Party in a bind. To backtrack to Fort Bridger would cost them days. They decided to wait for Hastings, but when he still hadn't shown up after 8 days, they sent a messenger into the canyon to find him. The party's messenger returned with instructions for an alternative route, which would take them through. The Donner Party traversed this pass successfully, but it turned out that it was more difficult than Weber Canyon would have been, as the members of the Donner Party were faced with thick trees and massive boulders. While returning to Fort Bridger would have cost the Donner Party a lot of time, it paled in comparison to what Hastings' alternative through the Wasatch Mountains route cost them. By the time they reached Utah's Great Salt Lake, the detour had cost them 18 days. Wasting so much time meant wasting valuable supplies. Making matters even worse, the party had several wagons get stuck in the mud and were forced to abandon them, losing them even more supplies. Next, the party traversed the Great Salt Lake Desert, which Hastings told them would take 2 days. Not only did it take more, but soft, wet sand caused more wagons to be abandoned. The stretch of the journey was 80 miles, and during the journey, they lost 32 oxen. The attitude of party members began to shift as they began getting frustrated with both Lansford Hastings and the man who had started many of them on the journey in the first place, James Fraser Reed. Lost time also meant that by the time the Donner Party reached the Sierra Nevada mountains, it was late in the year, when the weather in the mountains is, and was, at its most treacherous. The Donner Party had finally made it to the Sierra Nevada mountains, but because of the many delays they had faced, they got there as fierce weather started to appear. According to history, heavy snowfall on October 28, 1846 blocked the trail the party needed to take and trapped them in the mountains. Around this time, a broken axle on George Donner's wagon caused the group to split up, with most of the Donner family staying behind.
Monday 30th, snow and fast wind, about 4 or 5 feet deep. No living thing without wings can get about.
Multiple attempts to traverse the trail anyway failed, and the remaining party members were forced to build shelters to wait out the winter. Multiple families were forced to share hastily built cabins, crowding together for warmth. Food dwindled further, and they were forced to kill and eat the last remaining ox that November. After that, they ate whatever they could find, including bones and bark. By mid-December, a group of 5 men, 9 women, and 1 child took a chance and left the camp to try to make it over the mountains. This group quickly ran out of food and was caught in a blizzard. As members of this group died, the survivors turned to cannibalism. In early February of 1847, several search parties, including one led by James Reed, left to look for survivors. 2 weeks later, they found what they thought was a deserted camp, but quickly learned it wasn't. Not yet, at least. Many of those still there were close to death, and as rescue efforts dragged into March, the scenic locale would be dubbed Starved Camp. The party really did eat everything else first: oxen, then their hides, leather, bones cooked and recooked. Michael Wallace, author of The Best Land Under Heaven, The Donner Party, and the Age of Manifest Destiny, explained to NPR they ate literally everything before they had to turn to human flesh. They, of course, killed the great oxen, the horses, everything, and ate that meat. They boiled the hides. They picked out the bone marrow. They made this gelatinous, awful goo from the hides, and it had very little, if any, nutritional value. After everything else was gone, they were then left with each other. It's unclear who might have been deliberately murdered to provide meat for the survivors. It's certain that 2 Native Americans were shot and butchered. In a February 2017 interview in Smithsonian, Bill Schutt, author of Cannibalism, A Perfectly Natural History, explained why we shouldn't be so quick to judge. We have these sets of rules we try to follow, but when the going gets tough, that stuff eventually goes out the window. There's a biological directive to survive, and at that point, when you reach that extreme, you're not worried about the fact that there's a taboo. You simply want to live.
The misery we endure would make the coldest heart ache. We are so weak, we can scarcely walk.
Rescue parties spent more than 2 months trying to find and save those who survived. Of the 81 trapped by the snow, 45 walked out alive. Roughly half had engaged in cannibalism. Only 2 of the original dozen families made it out to California without suffering a death. The grisly tale of the Donner Party found its way into newspapers in 1847, where those who survived the ordeal were painted as murderers and derided for poor conduct, including alleged cannibalism. Survivors' accounts of what happened during the winter of 1846 and 1847 varied a great deal. Blame was placed on Lansford Hastings for a shortcut, which fell out of use almost immediately, while others blamed James Reed for ignoring the warnings he had received at Fort Laramie. The Donner Party incident and the publicity it received caused a significant reduction in the number of people traveling across the continent, but that dip wouldn't last long. In 1848, just a year later, gold was discovered in California. It was the beginning of the gold rush, and by 1849, thousands of people were once again racing out to California in search of riches. Ironically, many of these people traveled to the Sierra Nevada mountains and the surrounding areas, the same place where many members of the Donner Party met their deaths. The Oregon Trail was one of the primary routes for American settlers heading from the eastern states out to the Wild West. There was one major problem, though. The West wasn't actually wild, as it was already settled by the native people who had lived there for thousands of years. And though most wagon trains actually made the journey peacefully, once they began stopping to colonize the area rather than just pass through, resistance began, and with it came violence. Between 1840 and 1860, 362 settlers and 426 indigenous people died in clashes along the Oregon Trail, but no incident claimed more lives than the Utter-Van Ornum Massacre, the deadliest wagon train on the Oregon Trail. Of course, most of the time, the relations between Native Americans and the travelers moving through their lands was friendly, as it gave both parties the opportunity to trade. And most of the deaths that claimed the lives of settlers were from much more mundane dangers: accidents, drownings, diseases such as cholera, milk sickness, and unforeseen weather events. Not to mention, of course, dysentery, so the classic computer game Oregon Trail wasn't lying to you. And the trail was just about the worst place you could get dysentery, other than maybe a cruise ship.
A couple of cruises, dysentery broke out on the ship. I was not there. You do not want to be on a cruise ship when dysentery breaks out.
In the real world, of course, dysentery was no laughing matter. And on occasion, there actually was tension and conflict between travelers and the native tribes they met, which included the Sioux, Kiowa, Shoshone, Crow, and others. And the problem wasn't isolated individuals like the fur traders who had coexisted for decades alongside the natives, or even the odd evangelical who traveled along the trail trying to gain converts. No, the main thing was the claiming of land and resources by white settlers encroaching further and further into native lands. That's when resistance began. And when resistance became violent, some innocent victims got caught in the crossfire, which is apparently what happened to the members of the ill-fated Utter-Van Ornum Party on September 9, 1860. The group, consisting of 44 people including 21 children, was traveling west through Idaho on their way to Oregon when they were attacked by a well-organized group of Shoshone. The attack came in waves. When the party was first attacked, they circled their wagons in a classic defensive maneuver which had proven successful for many previous traveling parties along the trail. Usually this was enough to discourage assailants, but not this time. The turning point in the battle came when 4 ex-soldiers traveling with the settlers decided to save themselves and fled on horseback, leaving the civilian families to die. After a second wave of attacks killed off many of the oxen that pulled the wagons, the surviving members of the Utter-Van Ornum Party had to abandon their possessions and run. By this time, 11 of the 44 settlers were dead, with at least 25 natives killed. But it wasn't over. Despite the heavy losses on both sides, the indigenous attackers pursued the fleeing travelers. At least 7 more settlers were killed in the chase, including a woman and 3 children who remained behind to tend to their wounded. More losses were to come. Lost in the wilderness with no supplies, more of the settlers died. They split into 2 groups, but both were found by the Shoshone. One family of settlers were killed. The others were stripped of their clothes and food and left to die. And those who had fled didn't fare much better. 2 of the soldiers who ran were killed by natives while trying to cross a river. A third was forced to butcher his horse for food. But eventually, a couple survivors managed to make it to friendly outposts and summon help. Rescue parties were quickly formed, and a contingent of army soldiers scoured the area looking for survivors. What they found was horror. The handful of desperately starving people who somehow remained alive had been forced to resort to cannibalism, eating the bodies of those who had succumbed to the elements. It wasn't until November 7th, nearly a full month after the attack, that the survivors were safely brought back to the army fort at Walla Walla. Of the 44 members of the Utter-Van Ornum Party, 20 had been killed by indigenous attackers and 5 more died in the aftermath and had been eaten by their comrades. 15 survived, 5 who escaped and went for help, and 10 more who had been abandoned and resorted to cannibalism. Finally, 4 children had been taken as captives. 3 died in captivity. The 4th, 10-year-old Reuben Van Ornum, was finally rescued by his uncle on November 21, 1862, more than 2 years after the deadliest wagon train attack in Oregon Trail history.
If you're of a certain age, you probably remember booting up your MS-DOS school computer and typing in the commands to start up the Oregon Trail. It was one of the few options that let you get away with playing a game as part of your schoolwork back in the day. And between the graphics, the music, and the fact that you could shotgun a bunch of delicious wildlife instead of taking another typing test made Oregon Trail nothing short of an epic adventure. Now, of course, the game hasn't aged super well, but there are some things you might notice about it as an adult that didn't quite come through in your younger years. Wasting wildlife. No matter how much food you bought for the trip, you were almost guaranteed to run out of munchies somewhere around the midpoint. The good news was you could take your little bald self hunting in a fun mini-game. But there was a catch. No matter how much you hunted, the game would only let you carry 100 pounds back to your cholera-ridden, accident-prone family. So why did it let you keep executing animals? That seems like a poor lesson to teach kids about creating waste, right? Well, it's actually an accurate depiction of what happened across the West as humans stampeded their way through nature. Which, by the way, had done just fine for centuries under the stewardship of the Native American tribes who called it home. We believed in the myth of superabundance, and it basically said there was so much good stuff in the western part of the U.S. that we could take whatever we wanted and it wouldn't matter. In other words, when your 10-year-old self was gleefully shooting everything that came in range, you were reenacting what your terrible ancestors once did to real animals. But there was a better way. Happy hunting. Staying on the subject of the game's hunting option, there was a method for smart hunting you may not have noticed as a kid. Instead of shooting up whatever wilderness you happened across, you could have easily maximized your hunting trips to spend just a few bullets and earn that 100 pounds of food. And more importantly, you could have saved precious time that would help keep you out of the snowstorms later. The color of the ground changed based on the kind of terrain you were on, and the animals that showed up were based on the current type of terrain. If you waited for a green prairie to start spraying bullets, you'd get a buffalo. But if you hit the desert, you'd be left high and dry. True travelers. Before you ever got the chance to pollute the game's high score list with 4-letter words,
Ass.
there was an original list filled with vaguely old-timey names who were, surprise, surprise, actual people from history. Topping the original list was Stephen Meek, who navigated the unimaginatively named Meek Cutoff and led somewhere around 1,000 people in 200-odd wagons along his occasionally deadly route. Another was Ezra Meeker, who traveled the trail and was instrumental in preserving it, founding the Oregon Trail Monument Association. This might make you feel bad for replacing their names with immature gibberish, but then again, you were probably in 2nd grade. The travelers you met along the way, too, were named after real historic figures. One of the names that pops up a few times is Marnie Stewart, who traveled the trail in the 1860s. And Alonzo Delano shows up a few times to give some advice, too. And he published a book about his experiences on the trail. So these guys definitely knew what they were talking about, even if you weren't listening. Somber stories. Let's face it, the way Native Americans have been depicted in countless movies and television shows is pretty cringeworthy. Hollywood may have bought into the massive smear campaign when it comes to depicting the interactions between settlers and the tribes of people already living there. But you probably didn't even notice the Oregon Trail tried to tell you the truth. Every so often, you'll talk to a Native American when you're on the trail. The things they say are just heartbreaking. One Arapaho says, "When the white man first crossed our lands, their wagons were few. Now they crowd the trail in great numbers. The land is overgrazed with their many animals. Do any white men still live in the East? My people talk of moving." And there are others who pop up with sentiments echoing that one, talking about the destruction the wagon trains brought with them. That's pretty heartbreaking stuff. But hey, at least someone got their history right. Nefarious naming. If you named your party after your real-life family, congrats. You were kind of a morbid kid. And if you named them after people you didn't like, well, you were downright diabolical. Because it was absolutely certain that at least some of the people you trekked the trail with would contract some kind of grave illness or break a limb or perish en route to the finish line. Seeing your mom's name pop up on a little gray headstone halfway through was probably a pretty jarring experience indeed. But it may have actually been a formative wake-up call, because the sheer randomness of the injuries and losses was also quite reflective of reality. Sometimes difficult diseases spring out of nowhere for people you love. Sometimes your transportation's going to break down at a very inconvenient time, and you're going to have to improvise to get to point B. In other words, all those random broken arms, broken wagon wheels, and illnesses were really preparing you for your grown-up existence. Although it's probably a good thing you didn't know it at the time, so that you could still enjoy your blissfully unaware childhood.
How's it going? How's the weekend?
Well, Andy got dysentery. Yikes.
Who would have thought that a video game about carting through the uncharted West and a caravan of covered wagons, oxen, disease, death, and rifles would have become such a hit? Granted, the game didn't get it all right, especially the leisurely leg dangling in pools of fresh water. But there's something about the Wild West with its largely inaccurate vision of freedom, wandering on horseback towards sunsets, embracing one's rugged individualism, and so forth, that's led to the trek being romanticized in countless TV shows, movies, and of course, games like the Oregon Trail.
Nearly 500,000 pioneers traveled west, carving ruts so deep they're still visible almost 200 years later.
The real Oregon Trail, however, was the absolute pits. Legends of America recounts the advice that one anonymous settler had for anyone who wanted to make the journey from Illinois to Oregon from the 1830s through the 1860s, writing, "He must learn to eat with his unwashed fingers, drink out of the same vessel as his mules, sleep on the ground when it rains, share his blanket with vermin, and have patience with mosquitoes."
This is the new character of America. Frontier grit, rugged individualism,
Survival.
This settler might not have had the exact facts and figures. For instance, 10 to 15 people die for every mile of the trail, making it roughly 20,000 dead along the way, although some sources put the number as high as 30,000. If you knew you had a 5% chance of dying on a flight from Chicago to Portland, would you take that flight? And we're not talking about death from recycled plane air, barely edible food, or the discomfort of being stuck in a middle seat for hours upon hours. We're not even talking about death by plane crash, although that might be less agonizing. We're talking about death via a host of festering diseases. The list of diseases that killed people on the Oregon Trail is lengthy. There's cholera, which kills you through diarrhea-induced dehydration. There's respiratory diphtheria, in which the airways in the nose and throat become restricted by a mucous membrane that limits breathing and releases a toxin in the blood. There's also dysentery, which also causes death by diarrhea, except this time it's bloody. We've also got typhoid fever, which devours the intestines. Measles, meanwhile, is manageable today, but without antibiotics in the middle of the dusty, dirty, waterless waste bowl of the West, it meant certain death. Practically all of these diseases come from unclean water, which, if you recall from the anonymous settler's advice, wasn't in great supply when embarking on the world's worst one-way road trip. The Oregon Trail gang got this part all wrong. Lack of clean, fresh water, plus constant contact with unwashed family and strangers, companionship of equally unwashed animals pulling carts, it's a wonder anyone survived.
You let Monsieur Todd grab the martinis. I made them extra dirty. The stagnant pond water I found beside the road.
Besides all the death, diarrhea, fevers, lack of plumbing, dearth of clean drinking water, and hot sun that bakes flesh and encourages bacterial growth, there's yet another manner of death that claims settlers' lives along the Oregon Trail: run-ins with Native Americans. Granted, 362 deaths out of 20,000 total isn't too high a percentage, and according to the Oregon Trail Center, settlers killed 426 Native Americans in return. But there is the indisputable fact that the natives were there first. The Oregon Trail Center claims that native tribes, Sioux, Crow, Kiowa, Shoshone, and more, generally didn't have a problem with folks passing through their land. Most encounters ended peacefully, with settlers trading items like knives and food for goods like robes and moccasins. That being said, theft was an occasional problem. Tribespeople sometimes stole food, and if travelers were camped out by themselves, they were much more likely to be targeted. The majority of violent conflicts tended to crop up along the western parts of the trail, like the Humboldt River in Nevada, or the Applegate Trail that leads to the Willamette Valley in Oregon. Most of those killed by Native Americans, an estimated 90%, were killed along the South Pass between the 1840s through the 1860s. But regardless of cause, you might be thinking, hey, if I die, at least I'll get a respectable burial, right? No, you'd probably just get rolled over by wagon wheels intentionally to help minimize the appeal your corpse presented to scavengers or wolves. Life on the Oregon Trail wasn't easy, but you knew things were looking up when you saw Independence Rock. So why was this landmark so beloved by the settlers? The Oregon Trail is a historical route that marks the United States' westward expansion. Today, you can still see and travel along most of the paths the settlers used to reach the western reaches of North America. One of the landmarks along the Oregon Trail is Wyoming's Independence Rock. The rock is considered the halfway point for many travelers. Given its name by fur trappers who camped below it on July 4, 1830, Independence Rock covers about 27 acres of ground. It is 1,900 feet long, 700 feet wide, and 136 feet high. All around it, you can see the carved names of the people who undertook the long and dangerous journey to the western coast of the United States. So many people felt such relief at the sight of the rock looming in the distance that they decided to make their mark on it. Made of granite, Independence Rock spreads across the Sweetwater Valley. It was once part of the Granite Range that rose in central Wyoming some 50 million years ago until the wind eroded and rounded it out over the ages. A great number of indigenous tribes visited the rock and left their carvings before the settlers ever caught wind of it. Many of these earlier inscriptions have since faded. The oldest remaining carving is from 1824, but even this has begun to smooth out. Independence Rock held a great deal of meaning to settlers. Not only was it the halfway point on their journey, but if they reached it by July 4th, many knew that they would make their destination before the weather turned too cold. It was essentially a way of telling whether the travelers were on schedule. April or May were the best months to start the journey through the Oregon Trail because there would be plenty of fresh spring grass for the livestock they depended on for the journey. A spring start also meant that they could beat the harsh winter to their destinations, though there were plenty of thunderstorms to contend with. Once they made it to Independence Rock, many travelers would partake in July 4th celebrations. One settler, Martha Heckox, wrote that while they didn't have fireworks on hand, they sang patriotic songs and enjoyed a picnic lunch at the Rock. From Independence Rock, the pioneers continued west over the Rocky Mountains to Fort Hull, a trading post in Utah, then onward over Oregon's Blue Mountains. This made for difficult terrain, but it marked the final mountain range the weary travelers would need to traverse on their journey. They then followed the Columbia River to known settlements in Oregon or continued south to California. It's estimated that almost 500,000 people passed by Independence Rock over the course of about 30 years during the heyday of Western expansion. Of these, thousands carved their name or a message onto the rock, giving the site the nickname of the Register of the Desert. Some painted their inscriptions using axle grease or paint, but the years have erased most of these. Eventually, the establishment of westbound railways eliminated the need to trek through the Oregon Trail, essentially ending the use of Independence Rock as a route marker. In 1961, the rock was designated a National Historic Landmark, and a footpath now surrounds it. Several exhibits tell the story of the trails and the people that undertook the dangerous journey west. You can even see visible ruts on the ground that were made as the wagons passed through, as well as the many inscriptions the settlers left behind. Visitors can also hike up Independence Rock, though the Park Service asks people to avoid stepping on the oldest inscriptions since these are already fading. And since it's located in a state-run rest stop, people can picnic in the area too. While cars are far faster than covered wagons, and most people who stop there are tourists, it's nice to know that Independence Rock is still providing relief to travelers to this day. It was a game so iconic, it inspired the name of a microgeneration. Early 80s babies know all too well the dangers of dying of dysentery on the Oregon Trail, but what are the chances of losing a member of your party to it these days? Typhoid fever is caused by the Salmonella typhi bacteria, which gets into your body via contaminated water or food. Then it lives in your intestines and you spread it around by going to the bathroom and not washing your hands. As you might imagine, for folks traveling the Oregon Trail, proper sanitation wasn't easy, and as a result, typhoid was pretty common. Typhoid causes a severe fever, weakness, and a loss of appetite, all of which can easily lead to death. Especially if you're in the middle of the wilderness 100 miles from any sort of medical care and a century or so away from modern science. You might think that a disease that can be prevented by boiling water and washing your hands is probably eradicated in the glorious future, and you'd be wrong. According to the World Health Organization, about 11 million people get typhoid every year, and somewhere around 110,000 people die from it.
What's going on, Diaz? Are you sick?
Do you have cholera? Is it typhoid?
The danger depends entirely on where you live. In the United States, there are only about 5,700 estimated cases annually, but you're not entirely safe from an old-timey disease. WZTV reports that there were 71 cases reported in early 2021, prompting an alert from the CDC because 9 of the victims had not traveled outside the country, indicating a potential outbreak. An incredibly contagious viral illness, measles was once one of the most common diseases in the world. It's so contagious that once exposed, usually when an infected person coughed or sneezed near you or touched you after touching their mouth or nose, you were more or less guaranteed to get sick. Once you're sick, you'd get a telltale rash that would spread all over your body, a dangerously high fever, cough, runny nose, and sore throat. The College of Physicians of Philadelphia notes that most people survive the infection, but low-income nations can have a higher mortality rate. As many as 28% of the infected suffer severe complications that can lead to death. Measles was so common it was accepted as a fact of life. At some point as a kid, you were going to get measles, be miserable for a week or two, and then be immune to it for the rest of your life, unless it, killed you. Considering all the other hardships on the Oregon Trail, it's little wonder your family died so often from it in the game. In the mid-20th century, the disease was still responsible for hospitalizing 48,000 Americans every year, killing around 500. The good news is that measles is one of the earliest vaccine success stories. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention reports that since a vaccine was introduced in 1963, there are typically fewer than 1,000 cases each year in the United States. Cholera and dysentery are different diseases, but they kill you the same way. Endless, horrifying diarrhea that results in dehydration.
Cholera! You know cholera? The black. The latest offering in the Frontiers Disease of the Month Club.
A waterborne bacterial disease, what sets cholera apart is how fast it kills you. It can result in death in just a few hours. According to the U.S. National Park Service, cholera was one of the primary causes of death to settlers heading west along the Oregon Trail, and the National Oregon-California Trail Center notes that many people would turn up sick at breakfast and be dead by dinner. Today, cholera is easily treated if you have access to clean fluids and electrolytes. According to CNN, about 80% of cholera cases can be successfully treated this way, and there are actually several vaccines available to prevent the disease. More importantly, cholera is extremely rare in developed nations. The CDC, for example, reports that in the United States, most cases of cholera are actually contracted in foreign countries. And CNN notes that in 2019, there were 0 cases in the US. That's great for us, but the rest of the world isn't so lucky. In 2019, there were over 923,000 reported cases of cholera in 55 countries, resulting in 1,911 deaths. But the bottom line is that if you get cholera and you're not a 19th century farmer making a brutal journey west in search of a better life, you've got an excellent chance of survival. Diphtheria is a disease caused by airborne bacteria, meaning you breathe it in. You then walk around breathing and coughing the bacteria into other people for a while. After a few days, you'll develop cold-like symptoms and a fibrous coating begins to grow in your throat, making it hard to breathe. The coating can also grow over the nose and eyes. It kills about 10% of people who contract it. It's unsurprising that it was a major killer on the Oregon Trail, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica. A study on childhood vaccine development published in Pediatric Research reports that in the latter 19th century, it still had a fatality rate in children of 42%-49%. Luckily, there's a reason you've never heard of diphtheria outside the game. An effective antitoxin for treating diphtheria was developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the CDC reports that the modern-day vaccination has pretty much eradicated the disease in the US. There's some bad news on the horizon, unfortunately. According to researchers at the University of Cambridge, diphtheria is developing antibiotic resistance and cases are on the rise, doubling from 8,105 cases in 2017 to 16,651 cases in 2018. That's stoking fears the disease might stage a vaccine escape. Dysentery kills you so often in the Oregon Trail, it's no wonder the disease was most associated with the game. And once you learn a bit about dysentery, you kind of understand why it's so deadly. The disease is largely spread through contaminated water and food and incubates for a few days before hitting its victims suddenly with fever, inflamed intestines, and a near-constant bloody diarrhea that can quickly lead to death via dehydration.
There's definitely worse ways to go.
Amen.
Dysentery was no party.
According to the World Health Organization, dysentery today is considered one variation of diarrheal diseases. These diseases are collectively the #1 cause of death in children globally, killing more than 500,000 every year. And the WHO notes that the bacterial form afflicts about 165 million people every year, killing around 1.1 million. Surprisingly, according to the National Center for Biotechnology Information, there are still 450,000 cases of bacterial dysentery in the United States annually. There's no cure and so far no vaccine to prevent dysentery. What makes this incredibly tragic is that if treated early, the disease is usually survivable, but delays in diagnosis often lead to more severe cases, and it's entirely preventable through safe drinking water, proper hygiene, and basic food preparation precautions.